Hey families, welcome to class 10, which is all about Charles Darwin. I gotta say, I have been very hesitant to record this because this class in particular is really important to me. I owe Darwin my career, for one thing, and I'll mention a little about that later on in the introduction. But yeah, I just adore this man and his work, and it was really important to me to um, create an introduction that kind of you know paid homage to that. So I hope I do a good job. But please let me know if there's anything I could do better. In any case, let's talk about Darwin. So I just kind of want to prepare you for what you're going to have. I'm going to start by kind of talking about, give some indication of why I think Darwin is so important in the history of science and in the history of biology. And then we'll talk about his magnum opus, his major work, which was An Origin of Species, the impact it has on us and on science as something that is thoughtful and has a certain approach. And then we'll circle back. So um, I just want to start with some questions to think about as to why this is so important even today. Um, so one question is, why do heritable diseases like Huntington's and cystic fibrosis exist? I'm actually going to save cystic fibrosis for another day, but just keep that in the back of your mind. Um, why, after a successful cancer treatment, do we say that cancer is in remission rather than cured? Why do we worry about bacteria developing antibiotic resistance? And how do we leverage evolution to create human values? So now, onto the origin of species. Um, So what's funny is that Charles Darwin was kind of a goof when he was young. He just kind of wanted to play video games in his mom's basement, which, in the 1800s, just like riding and hunting. He dropped out of med school. He really hated it. Um, and, he was enrolled in theology. Um, and and one of the things I take away from this is that sometimes we need to find the field in which we're a genius, and sometimes we need to invent the field in which we're a genius. And Charles Darwin certainly did the latter. Um, and the other thing is that, while he was a theology student of all things, he would hang around this Professor Henslow, who, if I recall correctly, was a geologist and natural philosopher, and just, pepper him with questions. They would be talking all of the time. And so, what I like about this insight into Darwin's youth is that he really extracted value. Like he may, theology may not have been for him, but while he was a theology student, he found the values that were important to him, like a diamond prospector. And so it's something I try to emulate, even if there's a day where I have to do a task that I don't really like, to find some sort of value in what I'm doing all of the time. Excuse me. Okay, so now onto the origin of species. So when Darwin was a young man, I can't remember how old he was. I think he was about 25. He was asked to be a naturalist for the HMS Beagle, and I think it was his uncle who actually had to ride a significant distance to go to Charles Darwin's father in person and convince them that no, Charles should do this. He should go on this trip. And it was so lucky for us that he did. This must have been the most amazing adventure because for 5 years on the HMS Beagle, Charles Darwin traveled the world, and wherever they stopped, he would grab as many specimens as he could, over 1,400 plants, nearly 500 bird skins. So he would like hunt the birds, skin them, and like he and the crew would eat the birds, and then he would keep the skins as part of his specimens. Thousands of insects, fossils, mineral samples, geological samples, marine invertebrates, fish, you name it, he would find the most interesting samples and take them with him. And he was in this tiny little compartment on this ship. So that was quite an extraordinary thing. Oops. Okay, so in 1959, he publishes the first edition of The Origin of Species. And you're probably wondering, for almost 30 years in between the HMS Beagle and The Origin of Species, what was he doing? And the answer was a lot. His adventures kind of inspired him to just do a profound amount of biological research, most of which he did either in his garden or in his study. So he did pigeon fancying, which meant that he would breed um, pigeons, which had very unique characters. Um, he spent 8 years devotedly studying barnacles to the point where his young son went over to one of his little friend's house, and the son was like, "Where's your father's study?" And I guess the son's friend was like, "Well, he doesn't have a study." And Charles Darwin's son says, "Well, where does he do his barnacle work?" Like, he just assumed that every dad did barnacle work as devotedly as Charles Darwin did. And I laugh because I'm sure when Gracie was little, she had similar conversations like, "Well, where do your parents do their experiments if not in the kitchen or in the basement lab?" Um, so Charles Darwin was studying you know, how orchids reproduce because it was kind of a biological mystery. He was studying how vines wrap around and grow. He was studying how carnivorous plants like sundews have that mechanical action when they sense, um, the insects they're trying to consume. Um, why coral reefs will form these atolls around volcanic islands. Just to name a few, this is not an exhaustive list of all the things he was doing in these nearly 3 decades between the HMS Beagle's journey and the origin of species. He was busy, and he was corresponding with dozens of farmers and pigeon fanciers and natural philosophers, and you name it, he was interested. Um, he's oh yeah, and navigation. That was I'm missing a whole bunch. Uh, anyway, so yeah, he was busy. So okay, now what is the content of the origin of species? And I have a hard time distilling it. I will actually link to the book itself so you can read it for free. In all its, I want to say it's like 250, 300 pages. I read it a few years ago and I've read snippets of it recently. It's worth reading in its entirety or listening to it as an audiobook because um, it sounds like you're in Charles Darwin's study. Um, but the first thing he did was kind of um, try to talk about natural selection that's consciously done by humans. So this is part of the reason he studied and fancied pigeons so much, right? Because he had a pretty good notion that all of these species of pigeons, and they look really different. Some of them have really weird behaviors, um, all descended from rock pigeons, which are, very common everywhere. I've been in the United States, and I think I've seen a lot of them in Europe too. Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess they would be in Europe because he's English. Anyway, so it's a very common bird, and yet somehow all of these pigeons, which are true breeding, like if you breed one of these, I can't even see what it says, but one of these kinds of pigeons with another one of these kinds of pigeons, they will look nothing like this. They will look like that. That's pretty incredible. Um, so, eh, so, you know, people, I think a lot of people at the time thought that, if you just left these birds in the wild, they would sort of revert back to their ancestral characters, right? That either they or maybe their kids would look like the rock pigeons, even if they didn't breed with the original wild rock pigeon. He's like, we really have no evidence for that. It's true that if you breed one species of fancy pigeon with another, they kind of look like their original parent, but they are true breeding. And if you let loose a bunch of domestic pigeons and you see a generation or two later a bunch of rock pigeons, it's hard to say that they just didn't die out or breed with the rock pigeons, that they actually reverted. So what he's trying to argue is that these true breeding birds, their characteristics are heritable. They're not just kind of there because of the environment. Um, and one of the things he mentions is that like people wouldn't have thought to try breed pigeons with big tail feathers until big tail feathers appeared as a characteristic. Now, it didn't necessarily need to be the case that it was a heritable characteristic, but they wouldn't have even tried until that was a possibility. It wouldn't have occurred to them that it was a possibility until it was a possibility. Um, so what he's saying is that fanciers just kind of wait for a character to appear, and then they try to breed it such that, the next generation or the generation after becomes true breeding. They've got a male and a female pigeon. You breed them together. They both have this characteristic, and all of their babies have the characteristic. It doesn't always work out that way, but it sometimes does. And that's what he's calling conscious selection. You wait for a character, hopefully it's a heritable character, and you try to select for it. And then he goes on to talk about unconscious. So you might be saying, okay, that's great and all, but like that just seems like selection would have to involve a conscious will. And he says, well, no, not necessarily. You could expand this idea of selection to unconscious, right? So that's not crazy. You can imagine that, if a farmer's got a bunch of egg-laying chickens, the one that doesn't lay very many eggs, he's probably going to have for dinner. The one that lays a lot of eggs, he's going to try to breed. Um, he's not consciously selecting for, larger clutches of eggs, but it would be natural that that would be a consequence. And indeed, the chickens as we know them today are descended from jungle fowl. Those chickens only, first of all, they can go into trees where, domestic chickens are not great at that. And they lay maybe 5 to 10 eggs a year, whereas domestic chickens lay like 300 a year. That's a big difference, and it's a heritable difference. The genetics of it are actually kind of interesting, but Darwin wouldn't have known about that. So he says, okay, so not only could you have selection without a human trying to select for a trait, you could also have selection that where a human is not trying to eliminate a trait. So for example, if you've got farmers that are breeding racehorses, you would expect that over the generations, those racehorses would lose the characteristic of broad hooves and the ability to pull heavy weights. Meanwhile, the farmers, so those characters have gone extinct in those locations, right? At the same time, the farmers that are breeding plow horses, those horses would lose the small hooves, the slender, long legs, right, of race horses. So those characteristics would go extinct, and not because anyone chose those characteristics and bred away from them, just by accident, you know what I mean? Not by any conscious selection, but by unconscious selection. And so you might say, okay, selection makes sense, and it can explain, local extinction of certain traits, but it doesn't explain selection without humans, and it doesn't explain the extinctions of whole species. And that's where he brings in a lot more analogy. So I'm going to pause on origin of species and talk about something that Charles Darwin talks a lot about, but he didn't have these words, so it was a little harder to parse that. And so the words that he didn't necessarily have were heritable versus physiological adaptations. So again, we learned with Lamarck that it's not easy to distinguish between those two things, right? Like if you think about this adorable Arctic fox, um, in the winter, it's white. In the summer, it's darker color, its fur is dark, right? It blends in with its background a lot better in the summer. And in the summer, it also has pups, and its pups have dark fur and also blend in with the background better. You could imagine that if you could get an Arctic fox to breed in the winter, maybe its pups would also have white fur. Um, so it's, the question is dark furred pups coming because the mom has dark fur because of this physiological adaptation in the summer? Or is it a heritable adaptation? So let me illustrate the difference. If this poor, um, you know, vixen lost one of her ears, right? That would, as it's not a great adaptation as physiological adaptations go, but it's not heritable, right? Like her pups would not be born with only one ear. They would be born with two ears. So that's the difference between a physiological adaptation and a heritable adaptation. So another example is if you work out and lift weights and you get really bulked up, right? And then you got pregnant, your baby would not come out bulked up. It would come out like a baby, right? Like soft and, doesn't really have any coordination, like that stuff that it's got to build up. Um, so that's another example of a physiological adaptation. And if this seems confusing, it's not easy to see, not easy to parse what's heritable versus physiological, um, just by looking at something. Um, and it took a genius like Charles Darwin to figure out that these are two separate things. And let me tell you, there are PhDs that to this day do not get that difference. To be fair, the one I'm thinking of is an idiot, but we'll leave that for another day. Um, so what what does natural selection have to do with physiological versus heritable adaptations? Truth is, it only has to do with heritable adaptations, and here's why. So imagine you've got a population of lobsters. Maybe you only have two in one location, and they breed. And so the next year, let's say I'm just making this up, let's just say that they produce two offspring and they stayed alive, right? Now in the same location, you have four lobsters, and now they mate, and each pair makes two more offspring. You can see where this is going, right? You're doubling and doubling and doubling some more. That's an exponential function, and pretty soon the world is nothing but lobsters just crawling all over each other, except we know perfectly well that the world is not just lobsters crawling all over each other. And the question is why? And this is where, Charles Darwin's, return from the Beagle, he's fascinated by what he saw and he's trying to make sense of it. He takes a break and he reads a book by Thomas Malthus. And Malthus makes an observation. It's that the reason that there's not lobsters walking all over each other all over the earth is because there are limited resources, right? There's just not infinite lobster food. Which means that even though you may double the population the next year, it's not going to be able to double again, right? That's the say that there's only resources for two lobsters every generation. So what happens is those two lobsters, that breeding pair happens to have a heritable trait that makes it easier for them to get the food that they need, or more of their offspring survive, right? Their offspring survive they're more likely to survive, they're more likely to be the ones to carry on to the next generation or to produce the next generation's successful offspring. Um, so this idea of a geometric increase in population, but limited by a finite amount of resources, plus heritable differences, right? Like we see that each individual in every species is slightly different from every other individual. Some of these differences are heritable. If they happen to be advantageous, you are more likely to see those heritable, or at least an increased proportion of the next generation showing those heritable differences that are beneficial. Um, and this goes a long way to explain things like the adaptive radiation that Charles Darwin saw, right? Like he famously stopped in the Galapagos Island off the coast of South America. I want to say it was the coast of Chile. Um, it's somewhere on one of these maps, I promise. And he saw all these finches, and they looked pretty similar to one species of finch on the mainland. But like there were like a whole bunch of different finch species and very distinctive, right? Both in like the size of their beak, but also whether they ate predominantly seeds or predominantly insects, whether they lived mostly on the ground or in trees. Um, and if we go even further back in time and remember, we've already met Lyle, right? Lyle gave us good reason to think that the Earth was very old, that there was a lot of time in which you could see these radiative speciation. That goes a long way to explaining why all the species that Linnaeus discovered and Cuvier looked at were fundamentally connected in some way, that they all had something in common. It turns out they were right. We have pretty good reason to believe that every species on Earth that has ever been descended from a single cell. We call our Luca the last universal common ancestor. They may have been other cells that spontaneously generated, I mean, not in the sense that Reddy disproved, but like started being able to propagate. But there is only one that survived and led to all of us. But it did lead to all of us. And I just think that's amazing. So this idea of, um, you know, geometrically increasing populations curtailed by finite resources, um, and only those with heritable differences that give an advantage, surviving and propagating to the next generation, explains so much. So, for example, Darwin discovered some new fossils, and he already knew of a lot of fossils from Lyell. So there are species that have gone extinct, and both gone extinct in certain regions and are only still living in other regions, but gone extinct across the entire Earth. He found this Toxodon platensis, which he called like a rhino-sized rodent. Now, I think it was actually related to modern day rhinos, but clearly it is not the same, right? This species no longer exists. Um, so you can imagine that over time, all of its characteristics went extinct, more or less probably one at a time, leading to distinctly different species. Let's see, what else is explained? So, if you'd imagine that Lamarck was right and that species adapt to their environment, then you'd expect distinct species in each distinctive environment. And yet, Darwin saw over and over again that, particularly in volcanic islands, right? These are islands that didn't exist, and then all of a sudden they popped out of the ocean, right? And sometimes tens or hundreds of miles from any mainland. And yet, all of the species didn't look unique, right? Like it's not like species appeared and were perfectly adapted to this unique environment. No, they looked an awful lot like the species from the mainland, even though the mainland's environment was very different. Um, and then the other thing, it explains a lot more than this. This is just give you a flavor of what it explains. But it explains, for example, like, a lot of different species have coverings over their, an epidermis, either to, keep them warm or, you know, keep their blood sterile, that sort of thing. Um, there's no reason it had to be scales or skin or like humans could have as easily been covered with, or I should say mammals could have easily been covered with feathers as with fur, except that the common ancestor between mammals and birds split off, and this branch generated scales, and then feathers kind of, they're not like adapted scales. They're a different part of the epidermis that elongated, right? Whereas for mammals, we generated these cells that made fur. Um, so that's, and it explains why, you know, mammals don't have feathers, which, you know, may or may not have been more adaptive and birds don't have fur. It's just, our ancestors were already very different at that point. Um, so it now Darwin didn't I don't think he had much to say about this, at least as far as I recall. But it actually explains way more than Darwin could have anticipated, and he anticipated a lot. Um, so this is so when I was an adolescent, I worked with this model organism that is very, very well studied called Drosophila melanogaster. You guys have worked with that. Caenorhabditis elegans is a type of nematode, and there's like a little picture of it. Hopefully you can see my mouse right there. Um, and so one of the well-studied genes of C. elegans is this DAF2 gene. Now, if you have a certain mutation of DAF2, the worms live a lot longer, like twice as long, right? And the question is like, well, if they live longer, that seems like better survival, and this is all about survival of the fittest, so why don't all worms have this mutation in the wild? And there's a very good reason for that. It's not just about survival. Fitness has to do with propagation, right? So even over the double lifetime of these worms, like they have a lot longer time to have kids, but they don't have as many kids even over their extended lifetime. So you could imagine after 10 days, if the N2, the worms without the DAF2 mutation have 250 kids, and in those same 10 days, the DAF2 worms have less than 200 kids. Well, in the next generation, like in another 10 days, those 250 N2 kids will each have had 250 kids, whereas the, 175 DAF2 kids will only have 175. And you can see that pretty quickly, the DAF2 mutation kind of becomes extinct. The other thing that natural selection explains is stuff like sexual selection. So these are an example of bird, I think they're parrots, but I honestly can't remember. And the males have ridiculously long tail feathers, right? And like that makes it easier for them to get caught in trees, for predators to grab hold of them. It's clearly not, it's clearly a disadvantage, right? Like it's a lot of work to make those feathers, their food could be going to flying further or faster, anything. But they got to carry around these ridiculously long tail feathers. The question is why. So there were some scientists who would trim the tail feathers of some birds and stick those trimmed feathers onto the ends of other tail feathers for other birds. And the birds with the short tail feathers couldn't attract as many mates. And the birds with the artificially extended tail feathers attracted a whole bunch of mates. There is exactly one reason they're carrying around these ridiculously long tail feathers, and that is because the females of the species love them. So you couldn't explain that by, Lamarck's idea of like um, physiological adaptation. You could only explain sexual selection by Darwin's natural selection. So that brings us to the impact Darwin has on human health. And there's a lot of things you really cannot understand unless you understand natural selection. So, for example, I mentioned Huntington's disease. It is brutal. I mean, it involves, it really rarely sets on until middle age. Um, but at that time, neurons start to degenerate. So the nerves that help you to move, right? This poor person is wheelchair bound because the nerves innervating his, or not innervating, but that would normally stimulate the muscles in his legs have degenerated. It also leads to cognitive degeneration, which is horrible. Like, no one wants that. And the question is like, that's clearly not adaptive, right? To experience physical and cognitive decline. Why does this genetic disease exist? And there's a very good reason for it. It's because most of the people who have Huntington's disease don't know it until after they've had kids, right? And that's when evolution has nothing to say about a person, right? Like, if it doesn't make it harder for you to have kids, it's probably going to persist in the population. There's no reason it shouldn't. Like I said, it's not that it's not fun, but in terms of diseases, it doesn't affect how you have kids. So evolution has nothing to say about whether it can persist in the population or not. It's not to say that you know, it's not impactful. It clearly is. It's just evolution doesn't have anything to say about it. It also explains why as I've read, the number one risk factor for cancer is age. Most cancers, well, that's not the only thing that explains why the number one risk factor for cancer is age, but it does explain a lot. So most cancers happen in most people starting in their 40s, but really increasing well into old age. And the reason is that if you are prone to cancer, for example, if you have the BRCA mutation in the BRCA gene, you are much more likely to get breast cancer. And that, for most of human history, was a pretty devastating prognosis. And the reason that mutation persists is because evolution has no reason for it not to, right? By the time you start experiencing symptoms, chances are good you've already had your kids. You had a perfectly healthy kids, and they had perfectly healthy childhoods, and you were perfectly healthy as a parent. And once they were all grown, now you're really starting to notice a difference. It's tragic, but you really can't explain this without natural selection. So speaking of cancer, um, the natural selection explains a lot about cancer itself, right? So we have a few different ways of treating cancer. There's radiation, there's chemotherapy, there's surgical removal in some cases. Um, and so, cancer is a bunch of your own cells that aren't following the body's program, right? You can imagine if each of us starts as one cell and ends up with trillions, right? To make all of us and to make, cells for our eyes and cells for our skin and cells for our organs and cells for our bones. that they have to divide a lot, but in a very specific way. Um, Cells that just divide whenever they feel like it and in no specific way, whatever, those are cancer. Um, and once you get a good population of them, remember, they're not real particular about maintaining the integrity of their genes, which we will talk about later. So they're like you're generating a lot of these cells. They're all they're all distinct, right? That there's variation in each generation, quite a bit in cancer. And you can imagine that for any given treatment, it's not unheard of for one or two weirdo cancer cells to survive it, whether it's radiation or chemotherapy. Sometimes it's genetic and sometimes it's just you're just unlucky, right? But a couple of cells will often survive and they may start to propagate again, which is why we say, and if it's a heritable difference that made them able to survive your treatment, that means that the next time you can't use that treatment, right? If it's a particular chemotherapy and these red cancers, they're not actually red, these red cancer cells are genetically immune to this chemotherapy, right? They're the ones that survive. They will start to propagate. And now if you try the same chemotherapy, well, they all have that genetic mutation, right? That's why they exist in the first place. So that chemotherapy is irrelevant to them. That's why we often regard cancers as chronic conditions. It's like you have to do a new treatment each time, and you know, if should any cancer cell persist, you have to come up with a new treatment plan. I mean, you don't necessarily have to, but it's probably prudent. Okay, but there is good news too, right? We don't just need Darwin to explain things like Huntington's disease and cancers. And by the way, it's a similar thing with um, bacteria and antibiotics, right? So a lot of, I don't know if a lot, I've worked with a lot of bacteria that have a genetic mutation that makes them resistant to a particular antibiotic. And indeed, what's interesting is that it's a different genetic mutation for each antibiotic. Not necessarily, but I know of a lot of different genetic mutations, each of which confers a different resistance to a different antibiotic. It was actually really helpful in my career. Um, but you can imagine that if you've got a population, um, how to put this? So E. coli cells have about 2 million letters in their genetic code. And again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We haven't talked about genes yet. We will. Um, and every time you inoculate a little 5 ml test tube with E. coli, um, that's got 2 billion, or I should say 5 billion or so E. coli cells. You know, it's just a little amount of E. coli. That is enough to, on average, represent every single letter mutation at least once, right? It's a lot of letters, but you're dealing with even more cells, which means you're dealing with a rate of mutation, which means that somewhere in there, you've got someone who's resistant to streptomycin or um, uh, let's see, maybe gentamicin. What's the other one I'm thinking of? In any case, yeah. So yes, in any population of bacteria, someone's a weirdo, and it's probably a weirdo that makes them genetically resistant to a particular antibiotic. Um, so that's why we take all of our antibiotics, even if it's a 5-day course, take it all. Make sure you knock down those weirdos too, so they don't stick around and make it impossible for you to respond to antibiotics the next time. Okay, so what else can we use Darwin for? And there are actually a lot of really good things that we can use um, natural selection to leverage for human values, right? One of them is live attenuated vaccines. There's lots of ways these days to make vaccines, and one of them is to take a virus that is really deadly to a particular species but can propagate in a different species. So if a virus is really good at infecting a particular host, say a rabbit, right? Um, if you then are able to propagate it in a goat, you may do that over and over. Like the goat gets sick, makes a lot of virus, infects another goat, gets sick, makes a lot of virus, infects another goat, right? Um, that virus will evolve to be very good at infecting and propagating in goats, and very likely really bad at making bunnies feel bad and dying. They can still infect a bunny after they've spent generations propagating in goats, but they really are way better at propagating in goats, which means that if you put that virus back into a bunny, it actually is a very effective vaccine, right? The viruses aren't real good at, propagating. The bunny doesn't feel that bad. Um, but it's enough for the immune system to be like, oh, I recognize that. So the wild version of the virus comes along and the bunny's like, yeah, no, I've already seen your type around here, you're out. And then the virus can propagate, which is how a vaccine works. So yeah, that's really valuable. So I mentioned that I owe Darwin my career, and I can prove that. A couple of the patent applications I am on is where I was working with this organism that NASA isolated. It started its history as a soil organism, Bacillus pumilus, um, and I don't know if it just came in on somebody's shoe, but it ended up in the Spacecraft Assembly Facility, SAFR, at, JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. That's where they have this spacecraft assembly facility. And it's a clean room, right? If you're assembling the Mars Curiosity rover in there, and this is actually, I want to say this is Perseverance, but I could be mistaken. Um, so they sterilize the inside of these assembly facilities, and then they will swab, and they will try to see what they've collected on these swabs. You know what I mean? And they've banked these swabs for decades, and they kept seeing the same organisms they just could not get rid of. They tried bleach, they tried peroxides, they tried alcohols, they tried UV radiation, they tried gamma radiation. They tried all kinds of things to try to sterilize these organisms, get them out of the clean room, so that if you sent, one of these rovers to Mars looking for life, um, you didn't say, Eureka, we found it. Oh, wait, it's actually Bacillus pumilus from Earth, not anything Martian. Like, that's a lot of egg on everyone's face. And yet, like I said, there are organisms they just cannot seem to get rid of. So they sent them to space. And a few years ago, there were like these news stories saying that NASA found, bacteria on the outside of the International Space Station. They didn't find it; they put it there. They actually had these. You can make certain bacteria essentially go into hibernation, and they put them on coupons and they put them on the outside of the International Space Station. Um, and after 18 months of being in full sunlight and then full darkness every 90 minutes, um, and in the vacuum of space the whole time, and with significant amounts of radiation. I looked up, like, are they still in the magnetosphere? I think they are. So they're not completely unprotected from solar radiation, um, and galactic cosmic radiation, but they are not well. They're not having a good time. And yet, after 18 months of all that insult, they survived. And that's when I got a hold of them. Like, okay, how can we figure out how they do what they do? Like, how do they survive this? They started their life in soil. How are they surviving gamma rays in space? So I decided to just focus on one of their super resistant properties, right? UV radiation. And I cranked it up to 11 so I could see which genes, um, I should say mutations in which genes, made this possible, made them so resistant to UV. And the result was pretty wild. I mean, this is before so like I would grow them under UV, right? Just enough so that most of them died, but not all of them died. And then I'd give them, like a break and a snack and a nap. I mean, and and then do the same thing again. And I did this over and over again. You could see this is and if I started growing them in UV, they looked pretty normal. And but if like if I grew them in no UV, they looked pretty normal. I grew them a little bit of UV. Now they're starting to clump together and things are getting weird. Grew them in a lot more UV and things are looking different still. And after 40 generations of this scheme, they're real different. And in fact, I had multiple different lineages of these 40 generations, just like Darwin, right, with the different finches. And at least one of the lineages not only was good at growing in UV, but good at absorbing UV. And it was actually put into cosmetics as a kind of like SPF booster. Um, so yeah, here you can see them growing just like right underneath like this blue light is supposed to be germicidal. Anything on the bottom of this metal plate should be killed after a half hour, an hour of this light glowing, like this distance right here. And yet I had bacteria growing right underneath this UV light, not just like surviving, but growing. And growing in energies of UV comparable to Mars. Um, so that is the power of directed evolution. Um, and you can really think about, like given the harsh and very different environment of Mars, we have to think of like, the sort of evolutionary directions that any life on Mars that might be there would take. It would potentially look quite different from life on Earth. This is just to illustrate that like some of my bacteria could absorb quite a bit of UV and high energy UV. And when you put them in, makeup, they increase the SPF from at least, in the sort of in vitro tests, the SPF from like 20 to 120. So that's pretty cool. Okay. So the last thing I want to say about Darwin is not just about the science and the natural world, but like the his way of thinking and doing science. Um, that is so I don't think people talk about that very much, and I think it's really impactful. Oh, sorry. So even before the book starts, he quotes not one, but two philosophers of science. Bacon, we've already met. Whewell will meet shortly, but he's quoting two philosophers of science. So he's not only thinking about the science itself, but what constitutes a hypothesis and what does it take to prove something? Like where does hypotheses come from? How do you connect individual concrete observations to the functioning of the natural world and natural law? The other thing is that like one of his heroes, um, was John Herschel, who's also an astronomer and a polymath, and like Herschel and his sister were really cool, and I'd love to like have a whole episode on them. But he was also had something to say about how the big scientific discoveries were made so that we could leverage that to make more and better scientific discoveries. And he actually like makes a nod to our greatest philosophers. He's talking about John Herschel. So let's talk about Herschel and Whewell because like I said, you've met Bacon, the whole scientific method, um, observation, correlation, hypothesis, testing, isolating variables, testing. Um, either rejecting or accepting the hypothesis and going from there. Um, Herschel wanted to kind of build on that. So he just got a lot to say. I'm certainly no expert on Herschel. I will say this. To my understanding, he did not have a lot to say about how to formulate hypotheses, but he had something to say about validating a proposed causal law, right? What he called the vera causa, true law or true cause. The cause actually has to exist. If you're proposing that these observations correlate because of this particular cause definitely has to exist. That seems fair. And the presence of it is sufficient to cause the effect. So I'm trying to think of a good example here on the fly. I should have thought of this beforehand, but okay. Let's see. Think of it like a murder mystery, right? Um, you see a murder victim with a gaping hole in their chest, right? Um, a knife would be sufficient to produce that cause. If the knife also like it would have to have been like a sharp, long object that created this hole. The hole didn't just appear on its own and didn't appear from a hammer, right? Um, if there is a knife present, right, with a bunch of blood on it, well, now you've got two of the three things Herschel requires for a vera causa. Like the true cause of death was a knife. Um, but it also was important to him that the cause would both predict future events and post-dict previous events, right? So if you could use your formula to like accurately calculate an event that we know happened, right? That's pretty good, but it could be ad hoc. If it predicts a future event that then does happen, Halley's Comet is a good example of predicting of the predictive power of Newton's law of gravitation. Um, then you've really got something. And Darwin, like I said, was very much inspired by Herschel. So he really tried to emulate what Herschel was prescribing. Um, so, he does go through a lot of analogy, right? First, conscious selection by humans, then unconscious artificial selection to kind of expand it to how like there could be natural selection that doesn't, in which humans are not involved. Um, in terms of, so that's the causes it exists. Well, we definitely know that it exists on the human level. Um, so natural selection, you know, like is enough to explain radiative speciation, like all of those um, Galapagos finches becoming different species, even though they started as like maybe a mating pair from the mainland, and the extinction of traits and species. So it explains the fossil record, for example. But it predicts that you can use this for um, directed evolution, like what I was telling you that I've done. Um, and also post-icts that like physiological adaptation alone cannot give you new species. And there's lots of good examples of this. In the Soviet Union, there was a scientist and whose name I'm forgetting, who would try to domesticate foxes by just bringing them into a domestic environment, like in a cage or a pen or something. The foxes did not become any friendlier to humans. They would still bite them. They certainly didn't behave like pets. But I think it was his brother, or one of his relatives, um, would take like the 20% friendliest foxes, the ones that would come closest to humans. And he did this in a very quantitative manner, or spent the most time within his circle around humans and breed those and do that over and over again. And not only did they become friendlier to humans and more like pets, but they started having floppy ears and white blazes and wag their tails more like other domesticated species, which is really fascinating. So Darwin, um, the cause exists. Um, it is sufficient to explain a lot of these natural phenomena and makes new predictions and postdictions. Um, so um, Whewell, the other natural philosopher, and I think I should spend some more time with him. I just haven't quite planned it out for my series of classes. Um, I think he goes even deeper into how to be a good scientist, honestly. And he calls, whereas like, um, Aristotle called one of his works the organon, right? The mechanism, talking about like essentially how to do science. Bacon called his work the novum organon, right? The new mechanism. Whewell called his like the novum organon, I forget the last Latin word, but like again, like, we start with Aristotle, we graduate to Bacon, and now to Whewell. Like, it's very cool. Anyway, these, I mean, a lot of people throw shade on philosophers, but they can actually be really helpful to scientists. So Whewell had a lot to say about, again, the test of hypotheses, experimentation where you isolate variables and only change one variable at a time. Um, if it both predicts and postdicts, just like Herschel, that's, really supportive data for your hypothesis. Now, if it explains other things that you weren't even directly testing, like how Newton's law of gravitation explains the tides, right? Not just like the movement of comet, like Halley's comet, but the tides. Um, that's really powerful, and that's what he calls consilience. Um, Whewell also talked about what he called phenomenal and causal laws, right? So the perfect example, and I will talk more about this elsewhere in the channel, is Kepler's law. Like Kepler figured out how that first of all, the planets move around the sun, that their orbits are all their orbital planes, right? Like here's the sun, here's Earth's orbital plane, here's maybe Mars's orbital plane. They're a little different, but they all intersect at the sun and they all move in ellipses. Um, Now, he didn't know why they did this, but what he found was universally true. Um, that would have been a phenomenal law, right? He found a universal. This is always true. Newton found the causal law, gravity, the attraction of mass to mass, right? That it was sort of the causal law underlying Kepler's phenomenal law. Now, underlying each phenomenal law is a causal law, but then causal laws become the phenomenal laws of deeper causes, right? So if there's such a thing as a graviton, like a particle that causes gravity, right? I don't know if it is, I'm not a physicist. That would be sort of the causal law under Newton's now phenomenal law. So again, Darwin, you know, knew his Huel, right? So I think I'm not certain about this, but I think that's kind of what inspired him to do all this pigeon breeding and barnacle dissection. And he was actually experimenting with his natural selection. He's predicting and postdicting, so predicting you know, the discovery of new fossils and postdicting, why corals colonize in the way that they do. It explains geographical distribution of species, like I said, like that rather than looking unique and well adapted to the unique island environment, island species tend to look a lot like the species on the mainland. Um, and so not only is Darwin's law a causal law that, like I said, explains the fossil record and sexual selection and all kinds of other phenomena, the phenomena he could not have known about that explains the persistence of cancer and of certain genetic diseases. Um, Darwin's law becomes the phenomenal law, which is underlied by the causal law that which is genetics. And that's where Darwin's contemporary Mendel comes in. And that will be the next class, which I'm so excited for. Remember, the one thing Darwin didn't know is where these individual variations come from. He knew that individuals all have unique variation, right? And some of that variation is heritable, and he didn't know why. That was the one thing he needed for his theory, and that honor belongs to Mendel. So let's wrap up by talking about Darwin the man, his theory, and his published works. So, as a man, he was adventurous, like 5 years. I think he suffered from seasickness, but he was on this ship for 5 years, going all over the earth, gathering all kinds of samples, and hunting and spelunking and everything that he was doing. He was curious. He was so dedicated, like corresponding with like dozens of people to figure out this phenomenon and studying barnacles and pigeons and orchids and hibiscus and ants, and it just never ended for him. He was dedicated, right? Like working tirelessly every day for 8 years on his barnacles, just as an example. And he was gracious. Like, I just adore the fact that every other sentence he's thanking this pigeon fancier over here, or this farmer over there, or this philosopher in the first sentence, or this, you know what I mean? Like he was even gracious with Alfred Russel Wallace, right, who independently came up with the idea of natural selection. Although Darwin went a lot deeper, he was really gracious and was like, "Yeah, publish your thing. I'm going to publish my thing, and I'll endorse you." Like he endorsed Alfred Russel Wallace's papers and mentioned him in The Origin of Species. Like he was just, from everything I've read, he's such a stand-up guy, and just so admire that. Um, his theory helps us understand our natural world. Helps us understand ourselves and how we combat disease. And in the case of like directed evolution with live attenuated viruses and my bacteria that can be used as an SPF booster, they help us improve our world and like so many ways beyond what I've mentioned. And the origin of species as a work, demonstrates the power of inductive science, of pooling various observations and seeing if they correlate through hypothesis and experimentation, um, and finding the cause underlying these phenomena. So, thank you for staying with me for this long. I'm sorry I just chewed your ear off, but this was so important to me. So, as always, thank you for indulging me.